Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
There's been a flurry of activity on Capitol Hill in Washington as lawmakers consider President Trump's tax bill, known as the One Big Beautiful Bill.
It's called the One Big Beautiful Bill, and it will be the biggest bill ever passed in our country's history.
It passed the House in May and is currently being considered by the Senate. In the course of that process last week, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent testified before the Senate Finance Committee.
We appreciate you being here with us, and you may proceed with your statement.
Thank you. Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Wyden.
Lawmakers had a lot of questions, including what impact it would have on the deficit and inflation.
Senator
You're
Warren.
the Secretary of the Treasury, so I'm asking you, what is your view? Will this bill increase or decrease the deficit?
It is.
But over several hours of testimony, one thing kept coming up.
The non-partisan CBO, which is served.
CBO is one of our advisors. There's
that
so
same
advisors.
CBO that got it wrong then is getting it wrong right now.
The non-partisan Congressional Budget Office.
The estimate from CBO, I believe, is that over 15 million people lose their health insurance.
Well, look, your colleagues have a fixation on CBO, and listen.
And it's not the first time the Congressional Budget Office has been dragged into the spotlight. This nonpartisan agency puts together projections and analyses to help Congress determine the impacts of a new budget or new legislation on the economy. And this process brings out a fair share of critics who don't like the math because it chips away at support for the legislation. But this time around is a little different. And you could hear that in Bessent's comments to the Senate Finance Committee.
I am not attacking the people who work at the CBO.
Sure.
I am attacking their methodology, and the methodology is completely illogical. It assumes baseline.
The rhetoric around CBO has been heating up. But as the bill gets closer to passage, the agency has an important job to do. And so there was one person I really wanted to talk to, the director of the Congressional Budget Office himself, Phillip Swagel.
When our numbers go the way that someone wants, well, then we're heroes. When the numbers go in the wrong way, we're just the opposite. And the thing about the agency is that we're nonpartisan. Whatever the numbers are, well, that's what we print. That's what we convey to policymakers. That's our job.
I'm Saleha Mohsin, and this is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. Today on the show, I sit down with CBO Director Phil Swagel to find out how his nonpartisan federal agency focuses on economic forecasts when it's sitting at the center of a political firestorm. With Trump's tax bill moving through Congress, I wanted to start by asking Phil about the role of the Congressional Budget Office through the life cycle of a piece of legislation like the One Big Beautiful Bill.
So as the Congress is considering that bill, we are working with them from the very beginning really until the very end. So at the very beginning, the two chambers, starting with the House, were working on the budget resolution and setting out the overall fiscal parameters on which the bill is built. Then as the House considered the legislation, we worked with the committees in the House as each one developed their ideas. So on Medicaid, on SNAP benefits, the immigration policies, the armed services, everything, we work back and forth with the staff of the different committees as they develop their ideas. And we're just giving them feedback. We're saying, here's how much it costs, here's what we think it does, and they fine-tune it. Then we do a cost estimate of the whole thing, and that's all for the House. And now the Senate is taking up the bill, and we're doing the same thing again with the Senate.
What did you find from your analysis?
The bill has a huge amount in it. And if you look on the CBO website, there's a cost estimate for the bill that was passed by the House. And it's actually a spreadsheet. And it's a spreadsheet with many tabs, one tab for each committee, and then a summary. And then within each tab, there's a huge number of lines. But it gives anyone listening, anyone who goes to our website and gets the spreadsheet, it gives you an indication of how sprawling the bill is. And it has both tax policy, both new provisions such as the no tax on tips, and then extensions of existing provisions from the 2017 Tax Act. And then it has lots on the spending side, some healthcare policy, SNAP benefits, and much more. So there's lots in it. On the tax side, relative to current law, the tax policy increases the deficit. And on the spending side, the changes that were made in the legislation generally reduce the deficit. The net of those two comes out to $2.4 trillion over 10 years, and that's a deficit increase.
So right now, what are your Republican critics taking issue with?
I think the most salient criticism is that we, the CBO and our colleagues at the Joint Committee on Taxation, are not optimistic enough on the growth impacts of the legislation. Some members of Congress say, if the 2017 Act provisions were to expire at the end of this year, as is in current law, that would have a very big negative effect on the economy. And so then they say, okay, well, we think, therefore, this bill should have a big positive effect on the economy because it prevents that expiration. And, we've looked at it and come to in some sense, some agreement, some disagreement. We think that the bill does support stronger GDP growth, but it's probably not as big as some of the critics were hoping for or expecting. And so that's a substantive criticism. And in some sense, it's a kind of welcome one. I mean, if someone wants to know, well, why aren't you more optimistic on this legislation? Not in the normative sense, not like it's a good idea or bad idea, but why don't you at CBO think there'll be a bigger positive growth impact? Well, that's a completely substantive discussion that, we have within CBO every day.
You're pretty zen about it, though. You're getting attacked by the president of the United States, by the Treasury Secretary. He's not attacking the people who work at CBO, but attacking the math, the methodology, calling it illogical. What's your response?
Look, what the secretary has done is he's made substantive assertions that he thinks the math should be done differently. And I know he said this in a couple ways. One is on tariffs. And the secretary has pointed out that there's very substantial revenues coming from the tariffs that President Trump has put in place, since the inauguration of his second term. And in the secretary's mind, that should be considered as balancing out any deficit increase from the reconciliation legislation. And that arithmetic works. And so we found the reconciliation legislation increased the deficit by $2.4 trillion. The tariffs reduced the deficit by $2.5 trillion. And that is completely reasonable arithmetic. We don't have it in our cost estimate for the legislation just because the tariffs are not part of legislation. But we have a separate analysis that the secretary has pointed to, and that's completely a reasonable thing and a substantive thing.
After the break, we dig into the CBO's latest report on the One Big Beautiful Bill and what it's like to work there right now. This week, as the Senate considered the One Big Beautiful Bill, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimated the cost of the House version that passed in May. I wanted to dig into that process with CBO's director, Phillip Swagel.
The first thing we did was a so-called static analysis, or a conventional analysis that assumes that the economy is static, is unchanged. Now, the legislation, as I said before, is really gigantic. It's sprawling across this massive spreadsheet. One would expect that to affect the size of the economy in lots of different ways. Lower tax rates will give people incentives to work more, for businesses to invest more. There are changes in immigration that will affect the labor supply, and so on. In the first estimate we did, we essentially ignore all of that and just take the economy as given. The dynamic estimate we put out more recently, then says, well, let's think about those effects of the legislation on the economy, and then the feedback from the changes to the economy back to the budget. And that's the difference between the two.
Tell me the headline of the report from earlier this week.
So we and our colleagues at the Joint Committee on Taxation looked at the legislation, at all the many pieces of it, and said there's a sense of two types of effects. One is improving incentives for more people to work, for businesses to invest more, and that would lead them to hire more, and that increases the size of the economy. On the other hand, the deficit is larger. I mean, this is a tax cut, so revenues go down, and that increase in the deficit has an effect on the economy. It leads to higher interest rates. Now, it's a modest effect, but the higher interest rate then plays out over the very large stock of debt that the U.S. government has. And that goes in the other direction. That higher interest rates over a large debt means interest payments for the U.S. are much larger. And it's nearly $1 trillion of additional deficits because the impact through interest rates far outweighs the positive impact on the deficit from stronger growth.
I want to talk to you a little bit on a more person-to-person level. On Truth Social, President Trump said the CBO is Democrat-controlled. But you have previously served in a Republican administration. You're also an economist. How do you balance or even separate your personal economic philosophies from the job of overseeing a nonpartisan office?
The nonpartisan aspect of CBO is really the foundation of the agency. In fact, that's what I tell the new staff. When I meet with staff generally on their first day, I say, take a long view. You're going to work on legislation that you might think is a good idea, some things that you might think is a bad idea. Most of the people, almost everyone we work with on the Hill is really a very nice and kind of smart and wonderful person. Occasionally there's some people who are, less so, and we're going to support them just as hard and, just the same as the others. And just take a long view. It's important for Congress and for the nation to have an agency like us. For me, I start from there, and everything else is easier. The criticisms on, from the executive branch, from the White House. Again, I understand it. It's part of the political process. I expected it. I don't get worried about it. So I'm really able to separate the kind of political process from the substance. And I feel like none of it is personal. It's not about me. It's just about the political process.
I do wonder if CBO can weather the storm, though, because Bessent himself specifically said he's not attacking CBO employees, but the White House press secretary Carolyn Leavitt did say that CBO is a partisan and political agency. Mm-hmm. And she said that staff haven't contributed to a Republican since 2000 and have for Democrats.
There is some advocacy group that put out a report along those lines that I think she's leaning on. And it's just a completely made-up number. And the people who work with CBO, our counterparts on the Hill, they know our staff. They know we're nonpartisan. They trust us. They understand our processes. I feel like we're able to focus on our mission, a little bit tune out the noise, and just keep going. I mean, the thing you mentioned from the White House press secretary, it made me smile, right? In a sense, he's kind of, smile and just keep going because, right, as you said, she said something like CBO employees haven't donated to Republicans. That was it?
Since 2000.
Since 2000. But of course, I'm the director now. In 2014, a friend of mine was running for governor of California as a Republican, and I donated to him. Now it was,
and you work for President George W. Bush.
And I work for President Bush, and again, I understand as part of the political process. It's not personal. It really did just make me smile, make me laugh, and that's just the way to kind of respond to it. That's the way I respond to it. It's just to keep going and not to let it worry me.
And your staff, what was their response?
It's harder in a sense, because it can feel personal to people. Our staff are really dedicated. But again, I think people understand, my colleagues understand this is part of the process and just to tune it out.
You're an economist who supported economic policymakers during the W. Bush era. Do you support Trump's economic policy agenda?
I look at legislation and I just think about what does it do and what does it cost? And not, is this a good idea or a bad idea? Because we at CBO just do not think about that. And for us to support the Congress, it's really important for us not to think about that. And in some sense, if I do my job right, members won't know if I think their legislation is good or bad. And I think I've done a pretty good job of that. And I'm sorry, I'm smiling because there have been instances when members have tried to kind of suss out what I think of their bill, and I have been frustrated just because I say, look, I'm sorry, I can't tell you, it's just part of the job, and eventually they're satisfied with that.
That was Phil Swagel, director of the Congressional Budget Office, talking to us about the Trump administration's One Big Beautiful Bill and criticism of the CBO's analyses. This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Saleha Mohsin. To get more from The Big Take and unlimited access to all of Bloomberg.com, subscribe today at Bloomberg.com/podcast offer. If you liked this episode, make sure to follow and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.